Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you so very much for joining us for today's webinar put on by the Miriam Institute. And the subject of today's webinar is the New State Solution, a conflict-ending alternative to the status quo between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, and also the New State Solution, a conflict-ending alternative to the two-state separation plan. I'm Benjamin Anthony. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of the Miriam Institute. Thank you, all of you, for dialing in. I want to take a moment to express my profound thanks to my colleague Rosita Panini, the co-founder and COO of the Miriam Institute, and also on behalf of Rosita and myself, I want to thank my great and powerful colleague Alan Langer for coordinating this webinar. Thank you so very much, Alan. Now, today we will be discussing a topic that is of high interest and high importance and high relevance. Many of you who follow the subject of the State of Israel and its relationship with the great United States of America will be aware of the fact that the topic of extending Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley is very much of the moment today and will be for the coming weeks now, especially as there is a coalition that governs within the State of Israel. But applying sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, whether or not that occurs, is merely one aspect of a far broader quandary, which is how do we resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Well, we're going to talk about that, and I want, before I lay down some basic principles, to welcome back Brigadier General Amir Avivi. I'm going to read you his resume, and then, because we want to be pushed on this subject and challenged and to take the most robust questions that we're able to, we've got the privilege of again collaborating with the Miriam Institute adjunct David Benger. So let me just begin by reminding everybody just who these two esteemed individuals are. First of all, Brigadier General Amir Avivi. He is the founder and CEO of Habitronistim, which is a collective of senior security experts who are really pushing forward and promoting the idea of extending sovereignty to the Jordan Valley within the State of Israel. Brigadier General Avivi concluded his service as the head of the auditing and consulting department of the Israel Defense Establishment, which included the Israel Defense Forces, the Ministry of Defense, and the Israeli military industries. In that position, General Avivi managed more than 100 military auditors and advisors. He was responsible for the audit of military readiness, budgeting, procurement, projects, bids, cyber, logistics, infrastructure, and operations. Avivi fulfilled various command positions in the Corps of Engineers prior to that position, where he led thousands of soldiers in a dynamic combat environment. Now, as I always like to emphasize when we have the pleasure of being joined by General Avivi, the fact that he was the senior auditor, ladies and gentlemen, does not mean that he is an accountant. He is not an accountant, not that there's anything wrong with accountants. He's an auditor of military readiness, and that is a consequence of his rich combat background as a senior commander in the Israel Defense Forces. General Avivi served as the brigade commander, deputy division commander, and head of the military school of engineers within the Israel Defense Forces. He also served as the aide-de-camp for the chief of the general staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Lieutenant General Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. Avivi was at the heart of the policy-making process in the Israeli government and the defense establishment during that term, and he also serves as the principal of the New State Solution Working Group. So firstly, thank you so very much, General Avivi, for being with us. I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful, and you're very audible to our audience. And I also want to make mention of our moderator who will come in after our preliminary comments, David Benger. David Benger is a third year, well, actually, he's just completed his final exams at Harvard Law School, so congratulations to David. He's a third year JD student at Harvard Law School. At Harvard, David is the chapter president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law and the events chair of the Harvard Law School Alliance for Israel. He's also an editor on the Journal of Law and Public Policy and the Harvard Law School National Security Journal. Previously, David was an investigative analyst at the New York DA's Major Economic Crimes Bureau, so another auditor of kinds, a judicial intern in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and a legal assistant on a trial team at the International Criminal Court. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and Russian Studies from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Global Affairs from Tsinghua University in Beijing, where he studied as a Schwarzman Scholar. His commentary has been published in the Boston Globe, New York Daily News, Lawfare, Times of Israel, and elsewhere. And I want to, though he's not on camera at the moment, reiterate our congratulations to him on behalf of everybody for completing his studies at Harvard Law School. And we are honored that he will be continuing his involvement with Israel via the Miriam Institute, as well as with other organizations as well. Thank you so very much for being with us, David. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we want to talk about is the new state solution. Now, I'm going to speak very, very briefly about some of the underlying principles, though I rather suspect some of them will be asked about. I also want to make it clear that Alan will be able to open up the question and answer facility, so you can type in your questions if there's anything that becomes a question of relevance as we go through this. In fact, Alan, could you just come in, please, and direct everybody verbally as to how they can do that?
Yeah, so
thank you.
There should be a button on the bottom of your screens that says Q&A. If you click on that and you type in your question, it will go immediately to me and to David and to everyone else, and we will see your question and we will answer it live.
Thank you very much. And Alan, like the Almighty, I cannot see you, but I believe that you are there. So thank you very, very much indeed for being there and for giving us that directive. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on with our purpose for convening today. We are here to talk about the new state solution. The new state solution, ladies and gentlemen, is a conflict-ending alternative to the status quo between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, and it's a conflict-ending alternative to the two-state separation plan. Here are the basic points. It calls for the establishment of a free, sovereign, independent, viable, and thriving state for the Palestinian Arabs. I want to repeat that. A free, sovereign, viable, thriving state for the Palestinian Arabs, living side by side with the state of Israel, not necessarily in peace, but in security. That is the first principle. So when we say it's a conflict-ending alternative, we mean that it is not a peace plan. We believe that peace is somewhat ethereal at the best of times. It's certainly ethereal in the Middle East, but quiet would do, and an end to conflict would absolutely do. The second principle is that it calls for the establishment of that state where a de facto state for the Palestinian Arabs already exists, namely in the Gaza Strip. We call for the inversion of the Gaza Strip from being an intractable problem into an integral part of any solution. We therefore seek for the new state for the Palestinian Arabs to be anchored in the Gaza Strip with contiguity into approximately 10% of the neighboring adjacent Sinai Peninsula. That would be the geographical site for that. We will show you that in due course. So in the inversion of the Gaza Strip from an intractable problem into an integral part of the solution. Another principle of the new state solution is that it must deal in absolutely no trickery, meaning for many years, even decades, those who have espoused the virtues of the two-state solution have been criticized in some circles for doing so, because there's an ongoing question as to whether or not those who speak to its virtue actually mean that they would be willing to implement it. One of the examples of that is Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has spoken many, many times about the virtue of the two-state solution. He gave a famous speech in Bar-Ilan University calling for those parameters to be followed. But the ongoing question, unanswered incidentally, is whether or not he actually means it, or whether it's being thrown out there in order to put a distraction in front of audiences, governments, and the international community until such time as it becomes an urgent matter of importance astride the international stage. The new state solution does not work like that. The new state solution does not engage in trickery. It calls for the establishment of this independent Palestinian Arab state, but it calls for it under a dynamic whereby it is sufficiently tempting that if rejected, it's very obvious who is the party of no, and if implemented, the state of Israel can actually live with the outcome. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, there are many people who've called for the two-state solution, and there are many Palestinian Arabs who've rejected the two-state solution. But if there was to come to the fore a pragmatic Palestinian Arab who said, I accept the two-state separation plan, or the two-state solution as it's commonly known, the state of Israel would find itself, in our estimation, unable to implement the very policy that it has given lip service to across several decades in different administrations and governments. Not so in the case of the new state solution. If the Palestinian Arabs were to meet us at this, we believe it could be implemented, and we believe it could be implemented very, very successfully. In addition to that, contrary to what most people think, the new state solution does not accept the legitimacy of any forced transfer of either population. I want to repeat that. We do not accept the legitimacy of any forced transfer of either population, not Jews who live in Judea and Samaria or anywhere else in the state of Israel, and not Palestinian Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria or anywhere else. The idea to us of forcing a population to transfer from one locus to another is anti-Jewish. We are not supportive of that idea, and it's anti-Zionist in our estimation. Another thing is that it does not force upon the Palestinian Arabs a standard that we in Israel have not already shown ourselves able to accept and to adhere to. I want to give you an example of that. There are a great many people who endorse the two-state solution, but it doesn't actually offer the Palestinian Arabs an independent, sovereign, viable state in Judea and Samaria. According to the best estimates and the most generous descriptions, it merely offers a sub-state. Now, we in Israel would not accept sub-state status, and therefore we do not expect another people to do that either. In conclusion, as we go through this, and I'll soon turn it to General Avivi to make some comments of introduction, and then we will screen a video for you that will explain how the new state solution will look and appear. We believe that it's incumbent upon everybody to answer 5 questions when considering opportunities and methods to bring about an end to this conflict, particularly if you are somebody who to this point has espoused the virtue of the two-state solution or the two-state separation plan. Question number 1 is the plan that you are espousing practicable? In simple terms, can it be done, or does the geography and the circumstances at play prevent it from being practicable? Question number 2, is there proof, evidence, precedent that the plan you are suggesting is one that will meet with success, or does the evidence thus far speak to the idea that it will meet with failure? Question number 3, if you are somebody who espouses the two-state solution and its virtue, if that two-state solution is implemented as commonly understood, the separation plan, if it meets not with success but with failure despite the best of intentions from the international community, would you yourselves be willing directly to live with the outcome of that failure? Or is that something that is bequeathed exclusively to the people of the region when individuals espouse the virtue of the two-state solution? Question number 4, if the two-state solution is implemented and meets not with success but with failure, most importantly, would you be willing to have your children directly live with the consequences of that failure? Or is that a privilege exclusively bequeathed unto the children of the region? And question number 5, when you espouse the two-state solution, are you truly offering an independent, sovereign, free, viable, thriving state to the Palestinian Arabs, or are you offering them nothing more than a sub-state? And if the answer to all 5 of those questions, ladies and gentlemen, is not a resounding yes, then we humbly suggest it is only appropriate that you and others who might espouse the two-state solution finally move on to a new paradigm, to new ideas, to new opportunities, to new initiatives. Because after all, nobody would ever dream of imposing upon the people of Israel, who dwell in the land of Israel, a standard that they themselves would not live with directly or have their children live with, surely. So those are the 5 questions we want you to keep in mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, General Avivi, if you could please give us some introductory comments about yourself, and then we'll move on to the video by way of Alan.
Well, good evening from Israel, everybody. As you know, we're celebrating Jerusalem Day, the unification of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. So you see the picture behind me of the Kotel, but this is just a picture. This picture was taken on a balcony where me and my wife went. We got married in a balcony overlooking the Kotel and the Temple Mount the day before Rosh Hashanah, 15 years ago, and it's probably the most memorable and meaningful thing I will remember. So we're very, very happy this day, celebrating our love to our capital and city, the heart of Jerusalem, the heart of the Jewish people. I was born in Jerusalem. My family has lived in Jerusalem for 15 generations from my father's side. From my mother's side, I'm a first generation in Israel. My mother was born in Bulgaria, and their family survived the Holocaust and made Aliyah in 1948 on the eve of Israel's independence. I spent most of my young life around the world. My father is a prominent diplomat. He was Israel's ambassador in Turkey, Chile, and Colombia. So I was educated in international schools, in American schools, and English schools. I graduated in a British high school, where I had the honor of becoming a house captain, which is quite a meaningful position to have in a British high school. And at the age of 18, I returned to Israel and joined the military. I spent 30 years in the military, many of these years in the field, commanding soldiers in operations, in training. And in the last 3 years, I was in the Ministry of Defense and oversaw and audited everything that basically the IDF and the Ministry of Defense are doing. It was a very, very interesting period of time. Having been in the field for so many years and having seen what's the price of war, I had a lot of motivation to try and seek for a solution, but a solution that first and foremost looks for what's good for Israel. We have a tendency in the last decades to think more about others and not ourselves. And I was looking for a solution that really, really makes sure that the people of Israel will thrive for eternity, and also a solution that will be viable for the Palestinians and will enable them to build their future as well. So I really believe that mainly people who actually know what war is have the understanding of how important it is to seek peace, but a viable one, a real one. So this is how we came about to think about the new state solution, and we'll talk about it here.
Thank you very much, General Avivi. We appreciate that. And before I ask Alan to screen the video, I would just like to reiterate that one of the bedrock principles of the new state solution is that there must not be any further concessions of land from the state of Israel in order to provide a homeland for another people. We all feel very, very strongly about that idea, but there are ways of bringing about an end to the conflict, and we'd like to screen now the new state solution explanatory video. Alan, if you can please put that up, we'd be very grateful.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often perceived as an intractable deadlock, marked by decades of failed attempts to broker peace. Why does this conflict persist, considering Israel brokered enduring peace deals with Egypt and Jordan, ending decades of hostility? Historically, two dominant alternatives have been promoted for this region, but both were flawed and met only with failure: the two-state solution. This paradigm proposes an Israeli withdrawal to behind the 1949 armistice line in order to create the space for an independent Palestinian state in the area vacated. But such a plan would dramatically weaken Israel's ability to defend itself by leaving it with a 9-mile waistline, placing its main population centers at a topographical disadvantage which could easily be exploited by terrorists or foreign militaries. This plan would also require the relocation of hundreds of thousands of Israelis currently residing in communities in the West Bank. And the two-state paradigm offers no solution to the urgent challenges emanating from the Gaza Strip, which have implications not only for the state of Israel, but for the Gazan people themselves. The Palestinian state would be divided between Gaza and a landlocked West Bank. Making the two contiguous would bifurcate Israel north from south. The one-state solution. This paradigm proposes that Israel unilaterally annex the West Bank and grant citizenship to all its Arab inhabitants. But this plan would involve imposing Israeli citizenship on Palestinian Arabs and therefore would likely increase antagonism as well as create a negative international response. And the demographic shift would dramatically affect and potentially destroy the character of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. But the significant flaws in both solutions do not mean that the region is doomed to endless cycles of conflict. Neither people should have to accept that as their fate. It's time to talk about the new state solution. By merging the Gaza Strip with a repurposed portion of the Sinai Peninsula, a new, thriving, independent, sovereign, and viable state can be created for all Palestinians. Egypt and Israel could guarantee respect for and defense of the borders of the new state. Israel, willing Arab nations, and the international community could invest in the development of the new Palestinian state and Egypt as the donor state. Technological and logistical support in areas such as water and agriculture could make this desert bloom. The new state's Mediterranean coastline would offer rich opportunities for trade, commerce, and tourism. The new state would affix its own migration policy so that anyone wishing to voluntarily relocate there would receive generous absorption and economic packages, setting them and their families on a pathway toward a far brighter future. Israel would retain defensible borders that would not put it at risk and would preserve its Jewish and democratic character. The Palestinians would have a state with a single, contiguous territory within stable and recognized borders, with room for population growth, economic prosperity, and national pride. The forced transfer of any population of either peoples would be avoided. Applying new thinking instead of old slogans could add to the legacy of audacious diplomacy between Israel and her Arab neighbors and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for all in the region.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
So thank you very much for that video. Alan, just before I bring in our moderator, David Benger, I know that there's been a technical issue with the live Q&A, and that's important to us. So can you just speak to how we can remedy that?
Yes, absolutely. So for everyone that is on the line on Zoom, we are also broadcasting simultaneously on Facebook Live. So I was made aware that there was no Q&A option in the webinar currently. So if you would like to submit a question, please go to our to Benjamin's Facebook page, which is Sergeant Benjamin Anthony, and just post a comment under the video, and that will function as the question and answer from there.
Thank you very much. So, Alan, could you please bring in David Benga? And David, as everybody heard, is an individual who has hosted us several times at Harvard Law School and is now going to pose a series of questions to us and then bring the questions that were pre-submitted online by several of our listeners. And we've asked David to be sure to push us. David, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Benjamin, thank you once again for having me. It's a pleasure always to speak with you and to speak with General Avivi. And I'm excited to talk about the new state solution today. So my first question is, I think the question that's on the mind of a lot of people when they first hear the presentation is, this really sounds like a wonderful, almost utopian idea. What is it going to take to bring it from the video that you just showed to actual on-the-ground reality? What are the logistical challenges? Who are the stakeholders we have to convince? How do we get over the hump of paying for it? What are the next steps? If everyone's on board, what do we do next?
Thank you very much. So, General Avivi, I'd like you, may I call you Amir? Amir, is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
So can you begin by zoning in on the aspect of stakeholders that David asked about? Who are the stakeholders? Let's start there.
Well, I think that first and foremost, I think we're talking about the people of Israel who have been divided for many years, half or more completely against a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. The other half advocating for a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. And it seems to me that everybody now is stressed because of the Trump's plan. So Trump's plan pretty much destroys the ideas pushed by the left in the separation plan. So if we apply sovereignty, this is basically the end of this idea. And when we look at the right wing, who oppose the Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, they're also not very happy. They want to apply sovereignty, of course, in the Jewish towns and in the Jordan River, but they oppose completely the next step, which is enlarging the area of the Palestinians and creating a state, which many view will be dangerous. So this idea, what's wonderful about it, it can unify the people of Israel. I've talked to people in the left, in the right, everybody can live with such an idea. It's not about left and right. It's just a Bible idea, and it can be accepted by everybody. Another whole takeaway important is the Western world. I think that the Western world is ready to change paradigm. We have been talking to many people in the States and in Europe, in universities, in governments, in Britain, in the States, in France, in Poland, and everybody understands that there is a problem with the current solution. We need something else. So there's a lot of openness. The Egyptians, of course, are very big stakeholders here. They are the ones that actually are requested to assist by leasing land to the Palestinians. But they get a lot from it, and we'll talk about it later. Why is it so good for the Egyptians as well? And at the end of the day, we have the Palestinians. We have the Palestinians who most of them want a future. They want a viable future. They want economy. 2 million of them, half of them are locked in a small place called Gaza with the width of 3.5 miles. It's not viable at all in the long term. The other half are offered something that is not remotely a state. So, of course, they need a better solution as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to supplement what Amir just said, David. When we talk about some practical moves and where we were with this, so the germ of this organization came about through my lectures on university campuses, when I would express that I'm against the two-state solution, but then I felt I can't just be the party of no. And then I was drafted to Operation Protective Edge, and I thought this is just an untenable situation. I've spoken about that before. You cannot have the same reservists called to the same essentially campaign against the same enemy with the same lack of conclusion, with the idea that you'll be drawn back there again in 2 or 3 years thereafter. And what we wanted to do was look at, and General Avivi was having his own thoughts about the Sinai as some sort of a resolution, but he was still in the Israel Defense Forces at the time and therefore not able to go into what might be deemed a political issue. But we wanted to move this idea forward as soon as we could. And so what people can see on our website, if they go to the miriaminstitute.org and click on the New State, the NSS tab, is they can see actually our briefings on Capitol Hill now. In February of 2018, General Avivi, I, Rosita, we led a group of generals of the Israel Defense Forces, majors general and brigadiers general. And we actually found out throughout the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, we briefed relevant individuals there on a bicameral, bipartisan basis. We also briefed staffers, but importantly, prior to that, we briefed the Trump campaign at the headquarters of the campaign, and we had also briefed the administration in the White House compound, in the NSC, which is within the White House compound. Now, I can't go into the names of the people that we briefed because, as I said previously, discretion is important in these matters, but there was a real appetite for that. And what we were trying to do was, first of all, gain support from the Americans, Israel's greatest, strongest, and most vital ally, for this idea, which we did. As General Avivi said, people on the left, the right, and the center, they all had an appetite for this because they are tired of there being no progress on it, and they see it as an ongoing issue. And then what we were to do, at the behest, incidentally, of elected officials in the United States, was we were going to turn inward to the state of Israel and fan out across the Knesset. And we were all primed to do that. We had dozens of meetings arranged with the relevant members of the Knesset, and then elections were called, right? Elections were called, and we thought, okay, so we'll wait out the elections. That'll take about 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll be back there. And here we are after several rounds of elections, and we've essentially been stymied. But now that there is a government in the State of Israel, we actually plan to fan out throughout the Knesset and to start bringing this back to the front burner. We think it's very, very important, and we think that the moment is now. In terms of another aspect of stakeholders, I just want to express something. You can ask us more about this. The pendulum of politics is swinging. It's going to swing massively, either in 2020 or 2024. And I think everybody on this call, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, they're probably very, very troubled by the uptick in outspoken, overt anti-Israel statement coming from the Democratic Party, from elected officials in the Democratic Party. I think even dyed-in-the-wool Democrats will be troubled by that, and they should be. And we believe that when that pendulum swings, there will be very potentially adversarial language towards the state of Israel. And therefore, Israel has to put something in the middle of that pendulum swing that brings a resolution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, rather than have an adversarial government perhaps seek to impose that upon the state of Israel. So this is that. This is that idea, and that's why it's very, very important. Also, General Avivi made a vital point. A lot of people say Egypt will never give away a single inch of land. General Avivi's words are not arbitrary. When he says to lease the land, that's key. We're asking Egypt to lease the land. They can lease it in perpetuity, but to lease the land, not to Jews or to Israel, but to the Palestinian Arabs.
Okay. So to follow up with that, let's say for the moment that Israelis, that members of Knesset, the Israeli public are on board with the plan. The Americans are supportive. Let's assume that. There are some who argue that, in fact, the Palestinian refugee issue since 1948 is essentially an artificial creation, that there are nations in the Arab world who have a vested interest in ensuring that this issue continues and that it continues to be a thorn in the side for Israel, right? How do you convince those nations who fund a lot of infrastructure projects, etc., for Palestinian people? How do you convince them to allow this to go forward and to let this issue be resolved?
Amir?
Well, we have to understand what's going on in the Middle East. The Middle East today is nothing like it was 10 years ago. I want to remind you, talking about Trump's plan, that when President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu presented the deal of the century, and it was one of the most Zionistic moments I can remember in the last few years. There were Arab countries sitting in the room, clapping their hands. Trump said Jerusalem will stay forever united with Israel. All the religious places are part of Jewish history. Will apply sovereignty over all the towns, Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria. And the Arab countries sit there and clap their hands. And the day afterwards, Egypt says we support the plan. And then Saudi Arabia says we support the plan. So something happened here. There is a huge change in interests. And the main interest of the Sunni Arab world is to deal with the existential threat of Iran and get closer to Israel. They need from Israel three things. They need our help with security. They need our high-tech because oil economy is crashing. We see also now with the corona, the price of the oil. And we need less and less oil, so they cannot rely on oil anymore. And they see Israel as a crucial ally in maintaining the USA on their side. Why do they feel that? Because in Obama's time, Obama decided to side with the Iranians against his allies, the Sunnis. And they understood that it's not clear that the US will be on their side anymore because the US doesn't need Arab oil anymore. So the interests have changed completely. And they understand if they want to get close to Israel, they have to take the Palestinian issue out of the equation. They want a solution. And they understand that in this solution, Israel gets what it needs, mainly large parts of Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. And for the Palestinians, we need a different solution.
I would also just say that it's very, very difficult, David, to be more strident in one's pro-Palestinian views than the Palestinians themselves, right? It's very, very difficult to maintain that position. And therefore, if you see Palestinian Arabs voting with their feet, if you see Palestinian Arabs building up this state, if you see an enthusiasm among the Palestinian street for a new way forward, I think that the industry of perpetualizing and perpetuating the refugee idea will largely disappear and become a fringe issue rather than what it currently is, as you correctly described in the international community, which is almost a bedrock principle of many within the international community. So I think that would help to usher it along.
Well, okay, so then let's talk about the Palestinian people themselves, right? For whom such a big part of the narrative is this idea that they perpetuate of the right of return, that someday they will come back to their homes. You hear story time and again of Palestinian families who still claim to have the key that they carry around their neck to the home that their family once had in what is now Israel. So two parts. One, how do you convince that family who is committed to returning to their home to move to this new state in the Sinai? And two, assuming you can convince that family to do so, how do you convince them when you have Hamas saying, if you move there, we will shoot you? What do you do then?
Amir, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you want to understand Palestinians, one of the things that troubles me when people talk about Palestinians is that they think all Palestinians think alike. It's like saying, what do the Israelis think? Or what do the Jewish people think? We know that in our case, when you have two Jews arguing, there are at least three opinions in the room, right? So the same goes for the Palestinians. They have a very large set of different interests, and also Gaza and Judea and Samaria are very different. So let's try to break down what's going on in the Palestinian society. First of all, talking about Judea and Samaria, most of the Palestinians interact on everyday basis with Israel. They work in Israel. They gain 3 times more than they gain in the Palestinian Authority. If it was up to them, most of them would have liked to be Israeli citizens like Israeli Arabs. This is what they would like. We don't want that, they do. And many of them want to be part of the Israeli ecosystem. And the new state solution enables that because it gives them two things they want. They want to be proud Palestinians, they want statehood. So we're offering them the ability to have Palestinian citizenship and to be part of a Palestinian state, yet they get to stay in Judea and Samaria and be part of the Israeli ecosystem, part of $40,000 GDP and not $2,000 GDP. And so it's a win-win in many ways for the people in Judea and Samaria. In Gaza, because they are under Hamas rule, and this terror organization doesn't only terrorize Israel, it terrorizes the Palestinians as well. They have been conducting polls, and these polls show that 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza would like to emigrate from Gaza to Europe. By the way, the idea of Muslims or Arabs or Palestinians being really attached to the land doesn't hold ground. I mean, all the Muslim world is moving into Europe. They seem to be much more attached to Berlin than to any other land I know. So many of them would like to emigrate. And I think that if you enlarge Gaza, it's not moving Gaza to the Sinai Peninsula, it's enlarging Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. It's contiguous. And then they will have along the shore new resorts and places they can work and build their future. Of course, many of them will want to work. I don't know if you know it, but 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza don't have jobs. They don't get anything, they're starving. Of course, they will want to go out and work if the Hamas enables so. But once money will be allocated there and there will be projects, and the Hamas will know that they're going to gain as well from this deal, we might see a change. And if not, then we'll have to talk with Egypt and other countries, including the States, whether we have to bring down Hamas in order to move forward, which is also an option.
Okay, so let's talk about borders then, because right now the border between Gaza and Israel is very, very tightly controlled. Israel lets in humanitarian aid, water, electricity, that kind of thing. The border with the sea is also very closely controlled by the Israeli Navy, and the Gaza border with Egypt is, for all intents and purposes, sealed, right? I think that's right, but correct me if I'm wrong, General Avivi. If in this new state, what would you mentioned earlier that the Palestinian people want to have commerce with Israel. Would you imagine a more open, porous border with this new Palestinian state and Israel?
Well, I think that when we're talking about how to move forward with a peace plan with the Palestinians, we need to take Trump's ideas, saying, listen, we're willing to solve this issue. We're willing to give you a lot of land. We're willing to invest a lot of money. But you have to do your part. You're not going to get anything if you not disarm, if you don't recognize Israel's right to exist, and so on. So basically, the first issue is let's all agree on a vision, and vision that is viable, as Benjamin said at the beginning, something that if it actually happens, it's viable, and it's viable for thousands of years. Let's agree on that. Then say to the Palestinians, listen, if you want to move forward with this idea, you really need to mean that you want peace. You have to do some things in order to move forward. So I view a situation where if we apply this, it's when the Palestinians actually chose that they want to build their future and they care more about their children than killing us.
Before we move to the next question, I want to ask Alan. Alan, can you please bring up the topographical map of Israel, Gaza? Great. So, ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at here is a topographical map. I just want to direct you around this. Yes, Alan, can you move your cursor over to Judea and Samaria, please? Just move your cursor over to, yeah, exactly, perfect, right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that topographical area that Alan is so artfully scrolling his cursor over at the moment, that is Judea and Samaria. What the brown shading denotes here is the highlands. Those are the mountains of Judea and Samaria, meaning that if you establish a Palestinian state there, the Palestinian Arabs would have the topographical advantage, which goes to David's question about having a very restricted set of security or border arrangements, because you'd have to be very, very minimalist in terms of what you allow there in order to preserve the safety of the state of Israel. Alan, can you just move your cursor over Tel Aviv, please, on the coast? Ladies and gentlemen, to put that into perspective for you, that area of green denotes the lowlands of the state of Israel. Those are the lowland areas, but they also happen to be the most densely populated areas of the state of Israel. I'm talking about basically between Gadara and Hadara. Those are the densely populated areas of the state of Israel, including Tel Aviv and Gush Dan. Now, I want you to be aware of why the new state solution offers a viable state to the Palestinian Arabs. They'd have the high ground in Judea and Samaria. Alan, go back to that. Just the high, perfect. They'd have the high grounds of Judea and Samaria, but if you establish a state in Gaza, Sinai, Alan, can you please move the cursor down to Gaza, Sinai? Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing here is the lowlands on the side now of the Palestinian Arabs, and Alan, just move to the east. Perfect. And you can see here that Israel would maintain the highlands of the Negev desert. The brown shaded areas. Alan, move your cursor a bit to the south so that people can see the heightened areas, the elevated areas. Perfect. Now, not only would Israel retain the high ground, but also, Alan, just move into the Sinai now, roughly approximately where it's listed the word Egypt. You see that Egypt also has the highlands. The Palestinians would be at a topographical advantage. And what that means, to go to your question, David, is Israel could show much more largesse, and the Egyptians could show much more largesse and take a much more maximalist approach with regard to security arrangements, because there is the inherent topographical and therefore security advantage encompassed within this plan. Now, one last point. Alan, go up to Petach Tikva, please, in Judea and Samaria, okay? Now, from that little point there, stop right there, exactly. Now, from that little arrow that's pointing out to the left, ladies and gentlemen, to the coastline, the Mediterranean coastline, that is 9 miles of width. That's what the state of Israel would be reduced down to. We would have no strategic depth for the purpose of defensibility. By contrast, if you go back to the deserts of the Negev, Alan, if you could, please, just bring your scroller back down there, you would have this enormous natural buffer that would enable, again, Israel to take a more maximalist approach on the issue just by virtue of the geography at play. So I hope that is clear to you. One last point, you asked about being part of the Israeli ecosystem. What's propping up the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria is that they go into the Israeli communities, they build up and develop the towns and cities of Israel's communities, oftentimes termed settlements, which is a term that I disagree with. And then they go back to wherever it is they came from within the Palestinian Arab enclaves of Judea and Samaria. Imagine a scenario, David, whereby they could cross in from the Gaza Strip, build up the new state in the lowlands of the Sinai, and then go back, but they're building up a country in their image for them to inhabit, homes for them to inhabit, cities for them to live within. That's a far more glorious scenario than what's currently being offered. Alan, we can go back to full screen if you would.
Thank you for clarifying that, Benjamin. That was really helpful to see the graphic, I think, for everyone on this call. I'm going to turn to some questions that we've had submitted here. And first, I will ask General Avivi, you mentioned earlier that one option that that the IDF and the U.S. military may have to consider is taking on Hamas and pushing it out of Gaza entirely. One of our viewers, Rachel, asks, what has kept Israel from destroying Hamas this far? If this is an option, why haven't we already done it?
Well, we have to understand the overall situation. The situation today is that Israel is focused mainly on its northern border, on Iran, on Syria, and it draws a lot of our attention. Now, Iranians are funding Gaza and pushing them to shoot on Israel because they want us to conquer Gaza. They know that if we go into Gaza, all the world's attention and all the Middle East attention will be into this fight. And then the Iranians will be left alone to control all the Middle East. Our main war is with Iran. And we're not going to play Iran's game and spend 5-6 years with thousands of soldiers killed in order to achieve nothing, because they have nothing to do in Gaza. And if the world thinks that they should get rid of Hamas, we are all in favor of a coalition with Egypt, with the States, and so on, to take care of this issue. But we don't think we need to go into Gaza now and deal with it. We prefer to attack from outside and with the Air Force and so on.
Okay. Thank you, General Avivi. I want to take a step back, and the first question we talked about was about the stakeholders and the logistics of executing this plan. I'd like to dive deep in a little bit more detail, and if we can, sort of talk through a rough plan for creating this solution. What would the steps be? We'd first have to raise X amount of dollars to lease the land. Would the Israelis start building infrastructure on the land? Would they leave it to the Palestinians, the Egyptians to build? How do you imagine this really shaping out on the ground? I know this is your strength. This is a lot of what you did in the IDF. So how do you see the infrastructure really being built, and how do you see the money moving and being certain that it is not being used to corrupt or violent ends?
Well, the idea is conducting a BOT, which means basically not handing the area to the Palestinians, certainly not to the Hamas. This is Egyptian land, but encouraging private businesses to start developing the very, very beautiful coast of the Northern Sinai Peninsula. It's a very cheap place because today it's mainly controlled by ISIS, but you will have to first clean out the area, then bring in infrastructure, hotels, industry, and so on. Enable Palestinian workers to move from Gaza and work and build this future state. But all of this under Egypt and under European and American supervision. And only after it's built, after it's meaningful, after we see that it's working, and then looking at who is controlling actually the Palestinians, start seeing how to move it from Egyptian hand to Palestinian hand. So basically, talking about investments of money, they won't endanger the money. It won't go to terror. It will go to build infrastructure.
Okay. Benjamin, do you have anything to add on that question?
No, I'm happy to continue to the next question, David.
Okay. We received a question from Saul on Facebook, and Saul asks, number one, we have a strong friend in the White House, but that could change in January. Number two, we have a national unity government in Israel, which should help with more difficult decisions. Number three, the world is preoccupied with coronavirus, but that window of opportunity is beginning to close as the virus is sort of retreating, hopefully. And Saul's question is, when will be the next time that these three factors happen simultaneously? And what I believe Saul is getting at is, do we have to act quickly? Do we have to act now in some way to really get a foothold, get the solution moving? Or do you think that there is time and there will be appetite down the line as well?
Well, I agree with everything that was said. I think the stars are aligned for Israel. to move forward and first and foremost to apply sovereignty over large areas in Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley, and make sure that our security requirements for the long term are met. Once this happens, we can start talking about what's the next step. And I would suggest that the next step will be trying to think out of the box and moving into the new state solution, and not staying with the same idea that you can build two viable states in an area from the sea to the Jordan River for 45 miles. Simply unheard of.
So I want to actually weigh in on that, please, David, if I may. And did you say the questioner's name was Sol?
Sol, yes.
Okay, I want to give a bit of context about this, and I say this as a voter and as a veteran, as a taxpayer, and everything else that every other Israeli is. In the period of President Barack Obama's administration, many Israelis, and it's Israelis on the right and on the left, felt that the primary duty of Prime Minister Netanyahu was to hold at bay what Israelis, and I choose my words carefully, what Israelis viewed as an adversarial president towards the state of Israel, and particularly adversarial towards what's termed the settler movement. Okay, that was something that was injected in the conversation very, very centrally during the first White House summit in 2009, when Netanyahu went for the first time to meet with President Obama, having been recently inaugurated. That was a very real challenge. It was a challenge diplomatically, it was a challenge in terms of the personalities between the two leaders, Netanyahu and Obama. But that challenge has now gone. It's been gone since 2016 when President Trump came into office. And it's very, very important, and I actually wrote an op-ed, and people can look at the op-ed about this, with regard to Mike Pompeo, with regards to President Trump. I said on Israel, I prefer the Trump administration to his predecessor, on Israel. And I do. And I expressed that now what you have is this unique alignment that Saul's alluded to. It's not just President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, it's also the people around President Trump. So it includes people like Mike Pompeo. There was also John Bolton who was there, Nikki Haley was there, Jason Greenblatt was there, David Friedman was there, Jared Kushner is there. You've got Cruz in the Senate, you've got Lindsey in the Senate, you've got Cotton in the Senate, you have Mike Pence, who obviously is a great lover of the State of Israel. They were all there. Sure. And that was a wonderful opportunity, in my opinion, to move. Now, when you're given space, I don't think that space should be luxuriated in. I think it should be moved on. And I actually think that Prime Minister Netanyahu should have moved forward and said at the beginning of the Trump administration, these are our Israel's goals. This is our Israel's strategic goal with regards to the Israel-Palestinian issue. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I would simply say that urgency must now be applied to that, because Saul's question is correct. The only thing that I would take issue with is I don't know that having a unity government is going to make the Israel-Palestinian issue easier to deal with. I'm not sure. We have to wait and see. What Netanyahu has had previously has been a coalition government comprised of rightist elements within the state of Israel, within the political parties of the state of Israel. Now there are all sorts of strange bedfellows in the governing coalition. You've got people from the left, from Labour, you've got people from the right, and how they see the issue of the Israel-Palestinian conflict may differ one from the other quite significantly. And so I don't know how easy it's going to be for Prime Minister Netanyahu to move forward with things, but I think he absolutely should have done. What's past is past. Now I would call upon him and would like to see him do so. But it should be Israel's vision. It shouldn't be the vision of somebody else. Israel should decide Israel's own future.
I do want to push you both a little bit on trying to map out kind of a real visual of the logistics of how this plan would unravel, right? We get a yes from all the relevant stakeholders. What happens next? Can you sort of walk us through it? How long do you, from yes, do you imagine that eventually the Palestinian people will move from Judea and Samaria to this new state within a period of a year, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? What incentives would be provided, that sort of thing?
Amir, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to remind ourselves that the basic idea is that nobody needs to move anywhere, okay? We're not forcing anyone to move. But we are suggesting to create a viable state that will manage by itself its policy regarding how people can emigrate, Palestinians, just as we Israelis do. We give economic packages, we encourage people to come and live in Israel, and we expect the Palestinians to run their own policy. And if it's important to them to have all the Palestinians, people all over the world coming to this new state, that would be great. It's their choice. But it depends on how successful the state will be. And this is up to the Palestinians. If it will be a successful state, they will want to emigrate to their own state. If it won't be successful, I believe that many Palestinians will choose to continue and enjoy Israeli economy, not Palestinian.
With regard to the way in the timeline, David, we look to it being a 20-year plan. This is a generational plan. This is not something that you quickly set up. However, there are opportunities to do that. The State of Israel obviously is very well practiced in establishing a state from zero to what is now one of the most successful states in modern history. We could do that. We could bring our expertise and so on and so forth. As we say, it would be a gradual process. So it would begin with, we envision, you open up the borders of the Gaza Strip, you have people move in there and start to develop it. Obviously, the infrastructure for viable administrations would not yet be in place. So you have them develop it, build up the Sinai Peninsula, give them a workforce. You're matching, therefore, a ready workforce with a ready works program. That's very, very important that you have that economic base for the viability. Once that is developed, with the investment of Sunni states from the area and the European Union, and yes, the states of Israel, and of course the United States of America, and we don't have to reach for a vision here. The Trump administration has put a plan out which very, very clearly gives a number. It's 50 billion for investment in the Palestinian issue. Once you have that level of investment, then you can begin to see a state that thrives and that's built. And that proof of concept that Amir just alluded to is what we believe will induce the emigration from Judea and Samaria among the Palestinian Arabs into the new states. That's what we see happening with that. Okay. I think, by the way, I just want to give our listeners a quick heads up. We're concluding this at 2:15 Eastern Standard, so it's now 2:06. So 2:15 Eastern Standard will be concluding. Please carry on, David.
So as the state, that was very helpful, Benjamin. That vision is exactly what I was looking for. As the state begins to grow, presumably, this is imagined as an absolutely sovereign state with command of its own borders, etc. And yet, as we discussed earlier, it is necessary for Israel that this is not a state bent on Israel's destruction, that it recognizes Israel's right to exist, and it is that, and not merely a client state of Iran via Hamas or some other, or ISIS or some other organization. How does Israel ensure that while maintaining true Palestinian sovereignty in those borders?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Amir. I want you to speak to that because if you remember when we were at the NSC, that was the question of the gentleman from the State Department. Do you remember? It was, how do you get security circumstances as you're transferring this into a state? Please, if you could weigh in on that, and then I'll supplement if needed.
Well, unlike the idea of having a state, Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria connected to all the Middle East and all the way to Iran, here we're talking about a country that will be surrounded by Israel and by Egypt. So they won't really have a connection, a direct connection with some of the most struggling countries like Syria, Iran, and so on. And look, we're not prophets. We don't know what will happen in 100 years, in 1,000 years, in 500 years, and so on. The question we need to ask ourselves is very simple. If this state becomes belligerent, if they want war, are we in real danger or are we able to defend ourselves? And as Benjamin showed in the map, in the south, we control the high ground with the Negev mountains. They are on the shallow areas. We have strategic depths, and we have the ability to defend ourselves. And if they will have, even if they will have a military, in a way, it's better for us because for the IDF, it's much easier to deal with the military than to deal with terror. And it's a completely different situation than having Palestinian towns like 200 meters from an Israeli town, controlling from high grounds in Judea and Samaria. It's easy to defend those. I'm not really worried about what will happen in the future. We'll be able to deal with that.
Just a quick supplement about that, if I may. Israel is already deeply engaged in the security arrangements in the Sinai Peninsula. I don't know how many people know this, but after the 1979 peace accords brokered by President Jimmy Carter between Begin and Sadat, one of the stipulations was that the Egyptians were not allowed to mount beyond a certain amount of ordnance in the Sinai Peninsula because Israel would see that as a potentially belligerent act. That means that as Sinai has continued to be something of a no man's land, ISIS and other terror organizations, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and so forth are operating there. Because Egypt is not allowed to move its ordnance in there, and there is some flexibility about it, but by and large, they're not allowed to move it into the degree that they need. Israel is actually flying the sorties via the Israel Air Force into that area and helping Egypt. So we see that continued coalition, that continued adjoinment of forces to counter these pernicious entities continuing and only growing, but with an end goal, right? Not with a goal of what they call mowing the lawn, which I think is a dreadful term, but with a strategic goal, which is build a new state in Gaza Sinai for the Palestinian Arabs. Now, I just want, Alan, very quickly, can you open up the map of the Middle East? Because I want people to see what Amir just spoke about. Can you open up the map of the Middle Eastern countries? Perfect. Now, this goes to the heart of David, your question, the way you phrased your question. Use this phrase, a client state, not that slide, Alan, the slide you had before, please. There you go. Thank you. So you use this phrase, a client state. Now, Alan, move the dot, please, to the border of Israel-Jordan. Okay. Thank you. Now, if you build a state in this epoch of failing states, in that position, Alan, can we have the highlighter, please, on Israel-Jordan, if you can, when you get back to it? If you put perfect, keep that there, just exactly there, Alan. If you put a state for the Palestinian Arabs there, David, what you have is you have to the east a corridor of potentially pernicious states to the states of Israel. You see, everybody can see, moving eastward, you see Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and if you go north, you've got Syria, Lebanon, and of course, Turkey. What Amir's just said, and I want everyone to see this, is that if you establish a state for the Palestinian Arabs, and all of that, by the way, all of that would crescendo with dangerous forces, potentially 9 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, directly pressing Israel at her narrowest border. Now, by contrast, if you have a state here where we want to establish it, Alan, can you just move the cursor to the border between Israel and the peninsula? There, you can lock it up. You can lock up that state if it becomes belligerent. The Egyptian forces are a robust force. The IDF is obviously a very robust force, but there's something else, and then I'll move on to probably the last question, if there is one more. What this also means is you can go to the heart of a sovereign and independent state, because one of the things that you would have in the Palestinian state established in Judea and Samaria is a perpetual presence of Israeli soldiers within the Palestinian Arab state. Here, you wouldn't have to have that. Here, you wouldn't have to have foreign troops within the borders of the new state. You could have Egypt on the Egyptian side of the borders within the states of Israel, the states of Egypt, and you could have Israeli soldiers on the Israeli side of the borders overlooking it, but not encroaching within it unless it did turn belligerent. So I just want that to be clear to everybody. It could be a freer, more independent state. Alan, you can move that down, and David, I'd welcome the last question if there is one.
I do have one last question. And this is a question that's been culled from questions we've gotten on Facebook and questions that were submitted in advance, which both of you have seen combat, both of you have served the state of Israel. Golda Meir famously said that we can have peace when the Palestinians learn to love their children more than they hate the Jews. And I just want to be clear, I'm not speaking for myself when I ask this question, but I am speaking for a lot of our questioners, which say, in essence, ultimately what the Palestinians want is not sovereignty, nor is it economic freedom, but it is Jewish blood. This new state solution does not give them that. What they want is to be a thorn in the side, to delegitimize the state of Israel, basically this is the opposite of that. And I want to know what you guys, both of you, say to that particular challenge to your plan.
Amir,
First of all, I agree with Golda Meir. And unlike people who talk about peace and things that the Palestinians love us and just need to give them some land and everything will be fine. I know what they really want. I understand that. But I know what I want. I want Israel to be viable, to be strong, to hold most of the land of Israel, if not all of it. And in order to achieve that, you need to put a plan that is favorable to Israel, but it also gives a solution to the Palestinians so the world can relate to that. It's very simple to say the Palestinians won't have nothing, okay? But nobody in the world will agree to such a statement. So we need a solution that gives us the land of Israel, but also gives a solution to the Palestinians. And we are saying to the Arab world, you want business with Israel, you want our help with the Iranians, you want help with economical help, you want our high-tech, this is what we want. We want you to give land to the Palestinians and not take land from Israel. And if the Palestinians agree, they will enjoy it. If they don't agree, Israel will get what is rightful land of Israel anyway. So for us, it's a win anyway. So the new state solution gives two possibilities: win for Israel and lose for the Palestinians, or win-win. Oslo, the two-state solution, separation plan, is a lose-lose plan. It's a lose for Israel and it's also a lose for the Palestinians. We want a win-win, and if we don't get a win-win, at least a win for Israel. This is the new state solution.
Yeah, I would just conclude this by saying that when I was in my service in the Israel Defense Forces, David, not for a moment did any hatred towards the Palestinian Arabs or towards Hezbollah or towards Lebanon or towards anywhere else enter my heart or my thoughts. No, people may find that difficult to believe, but it happens to be the truth. I would imagine, I've never actually talked about this with Amir, but I would imagine it's the same with Amir. With all
Definitely.
What did you say, Amir?
Definitely.
Yeah, it doesn't enter because we're motivated by a love for the state of Israel, a love for the people of Israel, a love for our home, and a great, great love to bring quiet to our borders. And when you're under fire and in the pursuit of bringing that about, there isn't actually room in your heart for that hatred. For that reason, I can tell you that while Prime Minister Golda Meir may have been correct, that's not according to what you should legislate. You should legislate according to what is best for the state of Israel. You should not purport to speak on behalf of the Palestinian Arabs. And I would only say that I strongly, strongly believe that there is a very real element, a very profound and influential element within the Palestinian Arabs that does not carry that hatred in their hearts. There are absolutely some who do. But there are also a great many that when I lived in Ma'ale Adumim, I would work with, see on a daily basis. These people were friends. These were friendly towards the state of Israel. They loved the state of Israel. They were grateful for the state of Israel. And there's this old idea that if people have economic viability, they're much less likely to go to war. Let's give that economic viability sensibly, with the right caveats, with the right safeguards and the right railings. But let's work towards that. And I think that you would see, definitely, a downturn in the vitriol and in the bombacity of the Palestinian Arabs. And if you want an example of that, just see how much less militant the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, where they live off an economy that's subsidized by the states of Israel to a far greater extent, or that's undergirded by Israel, how much less bombastic they are than the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip. So there is hope. I believe that it can be done. And to conclude this, and then I'll turn it to you, David, to bring a close to it, I just want to say to Amir, thank you. I want to thank Alan. I want to thank you, David, also Rosita. And I also would like to ask everybody, if you want to know about this more, firstly, we'll be happy, Amir and I or others, to come and do webinars for your organizations, for your community events about the New State Solution. Secondly, you can find out more. There are position papers. We're not alone. It's not just Amir and I. There are many, many other people who are involved in this. look at the Miriam Institute and go to the New State Solution tab or the NSS tab and read the articles, look at the videos, share the videos, and follow us on Twitter. And I can assure you that this is something you will be hearing more and more about, and you can be confident in. We must not give any more of the land of Israel. We must not divide Jerusalem. And we must work towards a united, free, thriving, sovereign state for the Palestinian Arabs, and at least that as well for the state of Israel always. Thank you very much indeed for listening. David, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much.
Close.
Thank you both for your insightful comments and for your deep, thoughtful answers to my question. And thank you so much to all of our viewers who tuned in, who submitted questions on Facebook and in advance. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and may everyone stay healthy and safe in these trying times.
Amen. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Amir, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.